Please welcome Francois Nguyen.
Though its hands are silken, its heart is of iron. It lulls you to sleep, only to stand by your bed and jeer at the dignity of the flesh. It makes mock of your sound senses and lays them in thistledown like fragile vessels. Verily, the lust for comfort murders the passions of the soul and then walks grinning in the funeral. I actually had to look up what thistledown was. I did not know that word. Welcome back from lunch, everyone. My name is Francois. I am a creative director here at Frog. Well, not here, but at Frog here in New York. The title of my talk is The Cost of Comfort. I have 45 minutes with all of you, and I know you just ate lunch, so sustaining your attention will be a challenge, but there will be 3 group participation exercises, which I think will keep you engaged. And let's begin. I will be using Maslow's hierarchy of needs to go through all the different things how humans have found ways to serve their needs all through the different tiers of the hierarchy through the design lens. For those of you that will fall asleep soon, what I hope to leave you with is that all the decisions you make as a designer and even as a consumer has huge implications and impacts. And within everything we design, whether we create it or experience it, is an inherent ideology. And nowadays, it seems to be centered around comfort. It's something that we don't put as the center of our design principles, but comfort. I love comfort. I'm sure you all do. Actually, it's not even a choice to love comfort. It is part of our evolutionary mechanism. Human beings are built to conserve energy so that we can gather things we need and watch out for predators and other things like that. So I'm sure you've seen these kinds of things described in optimizing design experiences. Simple, affordable, fast, and easy. And what's wrong with that, right? That's a nice thing to have. But what I hope to explore here is the cost that has to not only the environment, but also to our mental well-being, our physical well-being, and financial well-being. So let's start with the first tier of Maslow's pyramid. This is fulfilling all of your physiological needs. That's we need to eat, which you've already done. We need to drink. We need to breathe. We need to sleep. If we don't fulfill any of these things in this hierarchy, nothing else really matters. So a very important thing we've done is find out how to feed ourselves very well. Humankind has gone through many agricultural revolutions, but the most substantial one happened in around 1750 out of England, the Second Agricultural Revolution. And through technologies such as this seed drill created by an inventor named Jethro Tull, not the rock group. Actually, this was the first agricultural tool with moving parts and then crop rotation and other things. I'm not going to get so far into that, but as a result of the agricultural revolution, we suddenly found an abundance of food. We had great ways to feed ourselves. And so what happened as a result of that? You had a population surge, and the price of food dropped. And so it kind of paved the way for the Industrial Revolution and all the products that we enjoy. People didn't need to worry about feeding themselves, so they had time to spend money and energy on other things. But back to food. You suddenly had this surplus of food. So how did we store that food? Well, another thing humans enjoy very much, their second favorite pastime, is war. And war, unfortunately, has been the catalyst for a lot of the developments we have in food preservation. The canned goods that you enjoy today was a result of a competition in Napoleon's army to find ways to keep his soldiers fed while out there conquering and colonizing lands. It should also be noted that a lot of the things you enjoy today, such as goldfish, and guacamole was also born from military research. And so in the United States, there's a lot of money spent on military research, and we love our processed foods. So it's no surprise that in a lot of these store shelves, we find a lot of these kinds of things that start off as military research things. And one of the things that came out of that, well, not out of military research, but in terms of preserving and accessing food, was the TV dinner. I've certainly had many shares of it, but a story that's very interesting about this is that this was born from a company called Swanson, their first TV dinner. They bought a surplus of turkey one year. I believe it was 1952. And so they had way too much turkey, and these execs were kind of in a panic. And they said, what are we going to do with all this turkey? And what was interesting was all these tons of turkey were on a train, a rail car on a train. And the only way to keep it refrigerated was to keep the train running. So while they were trying to come up with a solution, they had to keep sending the train back and forth from Dakota to New England to keep all this turkey frozen. And so what they came up with was, well, you know, one of the executives said, I like the way my meals are served in airplanes in these little trays, and why don't we slice up all these little turkey and make these little meals, and then we'll call it a TV dinner so that people can just heat it up right away and eat it in front of their television. And the first year it was released in 1953, it sold 5,000 units. And then the following year, it sold 10 million. And so that number just kept going and going. And that gave rise also to other devices. When microwave technology became commercially available, accessible to us, I should say, in terms of cost, that became synonymous with heating up these instant ready meal things. This is a microwave that actually Frog worked on using a solid state technology where you could target actually what proteins you want to heat up. And a demonstration showed fish frozen in a block of ice, and just the fish was heated up. The rest of the ice was still intact and frozen. 4,500 hamburgers sold a minute. So we've eaten in comfortably. What about eating out? Interesting statistic here. 20% of Americans eat their meals in a car. McDonald's and the drive-through is a big part of that narrative that's helped make that possible. I certainly have enjoyed a burger or two in a car. But this number is astounding in terms of how much meat we consume, and actually that's growing as the cost starts to drop. But there's a bigger cost to our environment. And then for people that don't, if that's not fast enough fast food, you have Soylent. I've enjoyed Soylent many times myself. And for those of you who don't know, I think it's a pretty young generation here. This name Soylent comes from a film in the 70s called Soylent Green. And it's a movie kind of about a dystopian future around 2022, which is we're a few years off. And there's only one city, New York, where we are right now. And people have to eat from this corporation called Soylent, which is soybeans and lentil combined together. And they came up with this new product. And the punchline is that they find out the Soylent Green is made from human remains because that's the only protein left for us to consume. And so this company, when they came out, they took inspiration from naming their company Soylent. And I think the irony is not lost in terms of how we cannibalize things. I think in this case, what are we cannibalizing here? Well, the cost of Soylent is about $3 a pop, which is great actually to serve certain countries that don't have access to affordable food, and they can fulfill all their nutrient needs. But what about the cost to a ritual? What about sitting and having a meal and talking face to face, and where all those wonderful interactions and understanding each other happens? Another thing about a minute, and you'll see soon why I keep figuring out all these things that are happening within a minute. 149 acres of rainforest are destroyed each minute. a large part of this is due to livestock industry. And so meat consumption has a big role in this. I believe meat is 75% more energy consuming than growing corn, for example. And so speaking of trees, I want to take a look at this tree and observe how it grows right here. And it's very unusual for a tree to grow like this, but it can do that because it has something called stress wood. And before I get into stress wood, I want to refer to an experiment done back in 1987 called the Biosphere 2. And it was about 3.5 acres or so of an enclosed dome space in Arizona. And it was supposed to be a self-sustaining ecosystem. They put a bunch of people there and with all the animals and vegetation that they needed, kind of like a Noah's Ark. And they learned a lot of things. Eventually, people had to leave because there wasn't enough oxygen. And one of the findings, which was very interesting, was the trees inside this biosphere, it grew a lot faster than the trees outside of the biosphere, but they all collapsed because they did not develop stress wood, which was critical to its strength and growth, which only develops from wind. There was no wind inside this biosphere. So wind pushing on the tree allowed it to be stronger and develop the stress wood so it could bend towards the sunlight and develop all the strength that it needs. And not too dissimilar to trees are also humans. Astronauts that go up into space, NASA has a mandatory program where all astronauts in space for about 6 months or so have to exercise 90 minutes a day. That is not compromisable. It doesn't matter what projects they're on, because when they return back to Earth, they would be crippled otherwise. We aren't aware of it, but the gravity that pulls on your body every day keeps your bones, keeps your muscles strong. So my point here is we and things in nature need stress to not only survive, but to be healthy. So if we remove all of these things that we need to still stay healthy in our daily experiences, what are we doing to ourselves? So group exercise number 1. Before I go into this, I want people to stop if they feel uncomfortable or feel like they're going to pass out. But what we're going to do is we're going to hold our breath for 1 minute. Because I've talked about all the things that happen for a minute, but you know, that's just a lot of talk. You don't know until you feel what a minute's like. So I'm going to first talk about how to breathe properly. And when you inhale and fill your stomach. If you're filling up your chest, that is not good. You're not filling in the depth of your lungs. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and then go. And then we're going to try to keep our breath held for 1 minute. Everyone ready? Okay, so practice that stomach breathing. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, go. Ooh, all right. Good, congratulate yourselves. I think there's a rule of 3. Like you can go 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. So good job, everybody. That was the first test. Okay. So we've already taken care of our physiological needs. What's next on Maslow's pyramid here? Safety and security. So A bit about safety and security. Our senses, specifically our sight, is trained to be aware of things for our self-preservation. And one of them is how we read shapes. Sharp edges, for example, like this square. The computational energy we spend looking at a square it kind of goes like this. Line, stop, line, stop, line, stop, line, stop. That's 4 computations. So that probably explains why the majority of things we see look like this, from your apps to your phones, slides in your pocket nicely. I actually did a talk earlier this year for Core77 called The Tyranny of the Rounded Rectangle. And actually, it ties in a little bit to Jerome's talk earlier about modernism and why we're stuck in this kind of a space where things don't seem to evolve past that. Because we're using the same principles at the core of what we think inherently life should be like. And so when you see this, aside from the eye moving around it very nicely and easily, the inherent ideology in this is that life should be easy and simple like that. And so we design things like that. Guilty as charged, I designed this speaker for Frog, and the next easiest thing to a rounded rectangle is a circle. So I've combined both to make your life even easier. This ties in actually to part of our heritage. At Frog, we designed a lot of the early Apple stuff for Steve Jobs, and he was insistent on the rounded rectangles. Actually, he didn't need to convince the industrial design team so much, but when he spoke to the coding team, he said, I need to have rounded rectangles in all of my UI. And one of the examples in convincing one of the coders was taking him to the parking lot and showing him this no parking sign. So that sign was a catalyst to a lot of the rounded rectangles we see today. But every now and then, you need to have something that is not a rounded rectangle. And when he got ousted from his company at Apple, he started Next Computer. And so what is he going to do? He's not going to do another rounded rectangular computer. He said pretty much, you know what? I'm going to make a point here. You know, screw you guys. And so this is going to be this hard-edged machine also that Frog designed. And so it took a markedly different direction from the rounded rectangle, which I think is still very relevant and nice today. And we actually borrowed some pages from that. The team last year at Frog designed this dishwasher, which was not round and comfortable, but this kind of a hard-edged cross-section of, if you took like a cross-section of water from the ocean, you get something like that. So speaking of other things with hard edges that are intended to get attention, you also have the collar on your shirt. So what kind of a strange segue do I go from that to a collar and shirt? But I'll tell you. This detachable shirt collar was the first product that was a single-use item. It came out in about 1820, and it was invented by a woman. Her name was Hannah Montague. And she was tired of washing the collars on her husband's shirts. She was just tired of that. And you know, the shirt collar gets dirty faster than the shirt itself. So she had this brilliant idea of having detachable collars so you can have a bunch of those and he can just keep wearing his shirt without a collar. And then they had all kinds of things like paper ones and plastic ones, et cetera. But this was the first product invented. And it was invented actually in Troy, New York. And if anyone's from Troy or knows about that area, that city is also known as Collar City. So this detachable collar was the very first single-use product that introduced to us the idea of, hey, you know, I can have this thing, and then I never have to see it again. I can throw it away. And this gave the idea to some guys in Boston around 1907, these two Bostonians. What they observed was, back then, to drink water, you go to a water fountain and you grab a dipping tin, they call it. They had these tin cups attached to, with a ladle attached to the water fountain, as you can see this person drinking here. But there was a lot of spread of germs and disease, et cetera, so they said, you know, we're going to come up with something, a paper cup. We're going to call it the health cup. And they created these cups with a cooler, and they were selling it primarily at first at railroad stations for 1 cent a pop. And then they eventually bought out another company's name, and it became known as Dixie. So that was the beginning of your Dixie cup. So now we have our single-use water cup, which leads us to today. So once again, that minute, every minute as we speak, 1 million bottles are consumed each minute. And it's really unfortunate. They've calculated in about 30 years, in 2050, there will be more pounds of plastic in the ocean than there will be pounds of fish. Hopefully, we'll think about that when we drink our bottled water. Not to make all of you feel bad, but maybe a little bit. So back to what my original intent of this talk was, to make us conscientious in thinking about all of our decisions as designers, as consumers. And I want to share my own personal story and my responsibility in things. And back many years ago, I designed the first Beats headphones. And at that time, Apple, because a lot of consumer products were following what Apple iPods were doing, Apple was switching their iPods from a glossy finish to a matte finish. And we had initially shown Dr. Dre the gloss finish. And there are many reasons to love matte, because gloss looks good for the first minute until people start touching it. Then it doesn't look very good, and then it scratches and doesn't wear well. And actually, an interesting side note, we're all also naturally wired to be drawn to glossy, shiny objects. And that comes evolutionarily from our need for water, our first physiological need, the glimmer of water, and also keeping our eye out for precious metals and other things that can help us as tools of survival. But Dr. Dre he really liked the glossy. And so we went with the glossy, and the first production run of this, they didn't get the paint job right. 1 in every 10 that was made had to be thrown out. So that first production run, 10% of it never saw the light of day. That also, one has to factor in all the plastic that goes in making that glossy thing so nice that you peel off when you first get it. So these little design decisions we make as designers have huge repercussions, and that's something we should all be aware of now. And to also confess about single-use things, I once owned a disposable single-use cutting board. I mean, the treachery. You cut something and then you peel a layer off. And trust me, every morning I wake up in cold sweats thinking about what I did. So, great. So this brings us to the third part of the pyramid, connection and belonging. What's up? How we communicate with each other. I want to start with this story of the typewriter, which I think is so fascinating. We all use the same layout today, and I'm sure a lot of you are savvy. You understand the story behind why this layout QWERTY exists. But I want to give a little more context for some of you that don't know or may not know the whole story. But back in about 1850, 1860, Remington, the same company that makes firearms, was looking to diversify its product offerings. And they came out with this device, the typewriter. And now the layout of these keys, you can see QWERTY across the top. Initially, there were several things that drove the layout. One of them was mechanical typewriters back then had these different swing arms, and so they arranged the keys in a way so that the arms would not get stuck and interfere with each other. So sounds natural enough to have a layout around the mechanical limitations or whatever parameter exists at a time. But there was another more devious reason for this layout, and typewriters had not caught on. The public had not bought into them yet. And so they wanted a sales tactic to get people to be interested in this. And so if you look at the top layer, QWERTY, you can also see that all the letters up there spell typewriter perfectly. And so they arranged it that way so that the salespeople could say, look how fast I can type typewriter. See? Rat-a-tat-tat, real quick. And so they also invested a lot of money into training programs to train people to use this QWERTY system. Well, I mean, let's fast forward to today. We still have this system. There have been many other iterations. We don't have swing arms on our smartphones, I don't think. And the reason why we haven't changed is because it's good enough. People have decided, hey, it's not ideal, but it's good enough. But it should be known that this design never had any kind of human-centered needs in its agenda. And I love the example because it shows that there are many paradigms and things that we inherently use, and we don't think about why it came about and the ideology behind it. So along with words and letters, we also have wonderful emojis. Now, these are some breakup texts. I did some research on that. It's a very dark hole to go into. Very, very comical as well. The one on the right shows a breakup purely in emojis. I thought that was quite clever. And I use emojis myself. I think that they're very good at conveying something very quickly. But the question I pose in terms of what is the cost of how we communicate now in terms of this language? Is there a cost? I think about my parents. I'm from Vietnam. My dad met my mom in the United States, and he had to go back to Vietnam. And they didn't see each other for 2 years. And all they did was write love letters. And he wrote, if you still feel the same way about me in 2 years, we'll get married. And they did. And I think that today, if you don't text me in 2 hours, we're done. I mean, our expectations now are proportional to, and so our emotional endurance also scales relative to these communication tools we have today. This is a piece of art I did made exclusively from typewriter parts, an IBM typewriter, and the letters I chose spell die kid, so you can write die kid very quickly. Anyways. And then, so beyond even just texting, we now have the emergence of all these devices we can talk to. I think there was a study done that shows in another 10 years or so, the number of personal digital assistants that we can speak to will match the number of humans that exist in this world. You've seen the movies like Her, et cetera. And so what is this like? What does this mean for digital devices that we now speak to? They've kind of gotten, in some ways, a status upgrade. We are now talking to them like we would communicate to our peers. And with all these communication technologies, do we feel like we're closer to each other or more isolated from each other? And I think studies have shown that the irony of that is, once again, because we're able to so selectively curate how we communicate. Like there are people that just only respond to me in text. They just don't want to ever talk on the phone. And I'm like that sometimes as well. Because we have so many different channels of communication, what has that done for our style of communicating and relating to one another, which isn't always in words? What was the story? Okay. So a story, we have an opioid crisis right now, and what is so sad about it was started from the health industry. And, but there's an interesting story about an experiment done called the rat park experiment. Now, back in the 60s and 70s, they did a lot of experiments with rats, and they put cocaine into their water. And the rats that were left in isolation, they would drink the cocaine-laced water until they died. They just obsessively consumed that. But then they did another experiment, the rat park experiment, where they had a big cage, and there were all kinds of fun things to go around, and there was a whole community of rats. And these rats chose the healthy water because they could interact with each other and run through these different kinds of amusement rides in the rat world, whatever that is. So that's where these addictions can be nullified in an environment, in a community where people feel connected and relating to one another. The headphone, for example, this is something that sometimes says, hey, don't talk to me, I'm closed off right now. But here's our take on it. Frog designed this a while back as a concept piece. We call this the unnum, which means to unnumb all this shutting out of the world and still hear it. Now, I cannot attest the audio quality of this, but that's the concept in essence. So this leads us to our next exercise. And there have been charts around how we communicate. 7% is words, so whatever I say here, you won't remember. But body language, you'll remember some things. And tone of voice is also a very important part of how we communicate. And so our next exercise will be with each other. You're going to do 3 things. First, look on your phone and choose a photo on your phone that's important to you. And then after you find that, identify someone sitting near you. So give you a little second to find a photo on your phone, identify someone near you, and then you're going to use primarily body language, vocal tone, and emphasis to communicate to your neighbor what this photo means to you, because the only words you can use are going to be the lyrics to 99 Bottles of Beer in the Wall. And if you need the lyrics to that, I could pull that up, but I think everyone does. And you can go down to about 96 bottles of beer in the wall to get your point across. So please take a minute and communicate to your neighbor how important this photo is to you. Don't be shy. Okay. Great job, everybody. Hopefully you got to know each other a bit better. Yeah. We're gonna rein it in. Okay, everyone, we're gonna rein it in. Great. Hopefully you all got to know each other better, I'm sure. Great. So next, esteem, self-esteem, but also esteem for oneself. You know who I am? We all have ways of defining ourselves. And I wanted to start with this picture of St. Augustine, who I read his works when I was in college, and I was always fascinated by it. And he defined the original hedonic treadmill. And he spoke in his own language, obviously, back then. But the hedonic treadmill today is basically you earn more, but your happiness is basically the same. You just fill that with more expectation and more stuff. Actually, I would say you probably are less happy. And so we are in this perpetual pursuit of defining who we are. And so how do we define who we are? And we keep accumulating more crap. So one way people define who they are is how they spend their time. Here's another 60 seconds of what happens on the internet. It's quite a fascinating little thing that I stole from the internet. But we'll look at that later. But in the interest of time, let's just keep moving. What I wanted to point to was GM. GM, General Motors, started this whole idea of planned/perceived obsolescence, which feeds that perpetual discontent and the whole mechanism of consumerism that we experience today. GM introduced the idea of a new car model each year. So people came to expect a new model each year. And the styling was different, but under the hood, it was essentially the same. So borrowing from that page, the fashion industry has done the same kind of thing. We now have a new fashion cycle every 5 weeks or something like that. And I'm sure you're all aware of fast fashion and the impact that all these lovely purple things have on our waters and other things like that. It's known to be the second biggest polluter next to the agricultural industry. And speaking of fashion, how we define ourselves also, that's a currency that we use because when we wear nice things, we also have to be seen somewhere with them. And that gave rise now with a lot of the social media stuff we have, these Instagrammable moments. Likes make me feel good. I'm not different than you guys as well. And how we get that little bit of dopamine hit every time this currency that we've created taps into this primal side of acknowledgement and acceptance within a social culture, because that means survival, being tied to a tribe. And so the more likes, more I'm ensured of my place within this tribe. Decades ago, a book came out called Flow State. And I try to recreate the diagram. It looks a bit like a flag of some country. But the idea here is as your skill increases, you need to stay within the flow channel. You need that challenge level to be just right, to stay engaged and at your heightened state of happiness, awareness, etc. If the challenge is too low and your skill is too high, you can be bored. And vice versa, if the challenge is too high and you're not skilled enough, you'll be in a perpetual state of anxiety. And I think the ideal spot to be is kind of on the upper side of that flow channel. Are we challenging ourselves appropriately to stay in that state of awareness and growth? And are these design experiences that we are consuming depriving us of that? This is an example that I always love pulling up, and it's a Betty Crocker one egg example. And Betty Crocker, back in the, I believe, 50s, released this cake batter mix that you just mix water with it and then you have a delicious cake. But it did not sell well because people did not, primarily housewives at this time, did not feel like they did enough. It wasn't enough to call it their own. They didn't have ownership, and there was no challenge to it. So then they had this add an egg, and then it sold like hotcakes. So just the right degree of added work, and then you have yourself a dynamic recipe formula for feeling good about yourself. This is a sculpture that I did because I thought a lot about that bubblegum kind of museum of ice cream that is out there, this Instagrammable moment. And I thought about when I was a student in college, what we used to do is stick gum underneath a student desktop. And so this is a sculpture. The irony, too, at that time was I was in a sociology class. So I titled this piece Sociology 101. And I chewed a bunch of gum, and I sculpted this starving family with a number 2 pencil. And so I guess that's my equivalent of a Instagrammable moment from back then, you know. But it's interesting to observe how people have patterns of behavior and how we have certain products such as gum that has zero nutritional value and actually costs quite a bit in terms of the pollution that it leaves existing today. So the final stage, self-actualization. How do we get beyond ourselves and think about things beyond our own needs and comfort? And I wanted to show examples that counter a lot of the examples that had been laid out before. There's a lot of slow movement that is countering the fast movement in food consumption, locally grown organic kinds of things. Also slow fashion, which is also like slow food, accessing things that are local, wearing the same piece of clothing for a very long time, bringing that back into trend instead of many different things. Another secret I'll let you in on is if you wear black all the time, no one knows the difference. You can just get away with wearing the same thing all year round. There's been a resurgence also of listening to record players. People yearn for ritual. A lot of the younger generation, they want to get the tangible, tactile experience of listening to music instead of just quickly accessing things on Spotify and looking at the liner notes. This is also return to craft. You can see people doing things, spinning clay and returning to woodworking. This is my own hand in woodworking for a skateboard I designed for a skateboard competition we hosted a few years back. And then Frog is also looking at things, dated paradigms like the speculum. We redesigned that and made it a lot better. Looking at other things like that have been kind of taboo, such as prosthetics. How do you make those beautiful? And using empathy, design, working closely, and hearing from the perspective of what amputees need and want. And then this company, Loop, they released earlier this year, they brought back the milkman model where they have products with containers that you can put out and they recollect, wash it out, and then give you a new kind of one in services. This is something Philippe Starck worked with Cartel to do an AI design chair. It uses 30% less material and is just as strong as any other regular chair. Something we did a while back in terms of thinking about the reuse story of packaging. All the packaging we created has a big impact on the environment, especially if you just throw it away after first use. And also companies like Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat, what they're doing to fulfill the carnivores in people, it uses 50% less energy than meat and about 90% less water. But there are a lot of good things on the horizon that are addressing these things. How we transform solar panels that used to look like this into these beautifully integrated ones that just seamlessly fit on top of your home, thanks to Solar City and my friend Remy who works there. So we're coming down to our last exercise. The first exercise, kind of learn how to breathe. This next one is exercising that breath. And you're going to first sit comfortably. You're going to observe your breathing patterns. And now what you're going to do is you're going to breathe in every time the metronome clicks on yellow, do a 4 count, and then breathe out at the next click of yellow. So let's do this. 3. Breathe in on yellow. Count 4. Exhale. Great. And then you're going to breathe in again. And this is called even breathing. And a lot of how we feel, a lot of the way we think is regulated back in the very basic physiology of our breathing. So let's keep that up while I play a piece while you guys do this. Great job, everyone. I hope you breathed along with that in and out. You should be in a more relaxed state. Got to wrap up here, but I just want to end with Steve Jobs and this quote that's not so commonly known, but he says here he's very proud of the things that he did not do, the choices that he did not make. And I think that the last thing I want to leave you with is that, once again, as designers and as consumers, the choices that you make have huge implications. The things you choose not to do also have huge implications. Thank you.